Broken heart opening emotional hook. Imagine giving your whole life to raise a family, only to be thrown out like trash by your own daughter-in-law, while your son stays silent. That's what happened to 62-year-old Grace Mensah. But just when they thought they had broken her dignity forever, she quietly handed them a single document, and suddenly the entire family was silent. The dining table was filled with laughter, clinking plates, and the warm smell of jollof rice and grilled chicken. Relatives who had traveled from far and near sat together, sharing stories and teasing one another. But in the middle of this cheerful gathering, Grace Mensah sat quietly, her wrinkled hands folded on her lap. She smiled politely, though inside she felt small, almost invisible. At 62, she had lived a life of sacrifice, raising her son Kojo after her husband passed. Now she sat in the house she had once built with love, but tonight, she felt like a stranger. Then, without warning, Abena, her daughter-in-law, leaned forward, her voice sharp enough to cut through the noise. "This house is mine. You've overstayed your welcome. Leave." Her words echoed in the room, and suddenly all the laughter died. Forks froze in midair, glasses were lowered, and every eye turned toward Grace. The air grew heavy, as if the walls themselves had heard the insult. Grace's breath caught in her chest. Her lips trembled, but no words came out. She turned her eyes toward her son, Kojo, silently pleading for him to defend her, to at least remind Abena that she was his mother. But Kojo shifted in his chair, his gaze dropping to the floor. He picked at his food as if he hadn't heard anything. That silence hurt more than Abena's cruelty. It was betrayal wrapped in cowardice. The relatives exchanged shocked glances. An elderly uncle cleared his throat, ready to speak, but Abena's glare silenced him. A younger cousin whispered under her breath, "Did she just say that to her mother-in-law?" Others shook their heads, their faces a mix of shame and disbelief. Grace's cheeks burned as though she had been slapped. Her hands gripped the edge of the table. Her body trembled, not from weakness, but from the deep humiliation of being rejected in front of family. Her son's silence cut through her heart like a knife. She wanted to shout, to remind them of the years she spent carrying Kojo through sickness and hardship, the nights she went hungry so he could eat. But the words stayed trapped inside her throat. Grace blinked back tears, her eyes fixed on the floor. The once lively table now felt like a stage, with her cast as the defeated old woman. Yet deep inside her chest something stirred. They thought they had crushed her spirit, but Grace knew. This was only the beginning. That night, the house that once echoed with her husband's laughter and her son's childhood footsteps felt colder than ever. Grace walked into her room slowly, her body heavy, her spirit even heavier. She picked up an old worn-out bag from the corner of the wardrobe, the same bag she had once used to carry baby clothes and diapers when Kojo was small. Now she was using to pack the last pieces of her life. Each fold of cloth, each item she placed inside, felt like a quiet goodbye. Her hands shook as she packed her few belongings, not because she had much, but because every little thing carried memories of sacrifices made for the son who now chose silence over love. Through the thin walls she could hear Abena's laughter. It wasn't the laughter of joy, it was the sharp, satisfied laugh of victory. Grace's heart ached. She wanted to scream, to remind them both that she was not a burden but the very root of the family tree they were sitting on. But instead her lips stayed closed, trembling in silence. By morning, the neighbors had already heard what happened. Kumasi was a place where news traveled faster than the wind. Women stood by their gates, whispering, "Did you hear? Abena threw her out." Men shook their heads, muttering. Even her own son didn't defend her. Some pitied her, some mocked her, but none stepped forward to stop it. Grace walked out of the house with her bag pressed tightly against her chest, her back bent, not from age but from the weight of betrayal. As she passed by familiar faces, eyes followed her with judgment and pity. Relatives who had once eaten at her table now avoided her gaze. A friend across the street, Amma, rushed over and touched her arm gently. "Grace, come with me. You can stay tonight." Grace managed a weak smile, though tears clouded her eyes. That evening she lay on a borrowed couch, staring at the ceiling. Her body was restless, her heart shattered. She whispered into the darkness, "I gave everything for my son, and he gave me nothing. A hot tear rolled down her cheek, soaking into the pillow. But even in that moment of weakness, a spark of strength flickered deep inside. She didn't know how yet, but she promised herself this was not how her story would end. The days that followed were harder than Grace could have imagined. Everywhere she went, whispers seemed to follow her like shadows. At the market, women selling tomatoes lowered their voices, saying, "Did you hear? Even her own family doesn't want her." At the church, where she had once been respected, she noticed how some people exchanged knowing looks as she walked past. Some pitied her, others judged her, but all of them treated her like her dignity had been stripped away. Abena, on the other hand, walked through the community with her head held high, her gold earrings flashing in the sun. She greeted people loudly, deliberately calling herself the woman of the house. She smiled wider, laughed louder, and flaunted her control over Kojo's home as if she had won some great prize. She bought new fabrics, showed off new furniture, and spoke as though Grace had never been the one who built that household from nothing. Each display cut into Grace's heart like a blade. One afternoon, Grace overheard two young women whispering, "Imagine raising a son all your life, only for him to let his wife throw you out. If even her own child rejects her, what good is she?" Grace kept walking, but inside she felt something shift. Yes, she was humiliated, yes, she was broken, but she was not finished. At night, when she lay on Amma's couch, her tears still came, but now they mixed with anger. Her mind replayed every sacrifice, selling her jewelry to pay Kojo's school fees, working extra hours to put food on the table, even going without new clothes so her son could walk proudly among his friends. And now, he had let his wife erase her like she was nothing. Grace pressed her hands together and whispered, "I will not die in shame. They may think they've destroyed me, but they don't know the strength of the woman who raised Kojo." For the first time in weeks, her heart beat with something new. Not just pain but determination. The community might have mocked her, and Abena might have declared herself the new matriarch, but Grace knew a truth they had all forgotten. Roots run deeper than branches. And though she was cast out, the fire inside her had only just begun to burn. Years before all this pain, when Grace's husband, Grace Mensah, was still alive, life was different. Their home was filled with laughter, with the smell of fufu cooking in the evenings, with children running in and out of the compound. Kwame was a man of wisdom, and though his health began to weaken in his later years, his mind was sharp until the end. He had seen the ways families could tear themselves apart over property, and he did not want that fate for his wife. One quiet evening, as the sun dipped low and painted Kumasi's skies orange, Kwame sat with Grace at the wooden table. His voice was gentle but firm as he said, "My love, the world can be cruel. When I am gone, I don't want anyone to question your place here. This home, this land, it belongs to you." Grace looked at him with wide eyes, shaking her head. "But why, Kwame? Kojo is our son. He will protect me." Kwame smiled sadly, already knowing a truth she did not. "Sometimes even blood can fail. But I trust you. You are the root of this family." Not long after, with shaky hands, he signed the papers. Every acre of land, every brick of the house, was transferred into Grace's name. She tucked the document carefully into a wooden chest, locking it away under clothes and blankets. She never mentioned it again. Not to Kojo, not to the relatives, not even in whispers to her closest friend. She believed in peace and trust in the bond of family. To her, revealing it felt like planting seeds of division. After Kwame's passing, Grace continued to live with quiet dignity, never once using the papers to assert her power. She trusted that love would be enough to hold the family together. She believed Kojo would honor her sacrifices, that Abena would respect her as the matriarch. But now, sitting on Amma's couch, her heart broken from the humiliation she had suffered, she remembered that hidden truth. Somewhere in that locked chest lay the very weapon that could change everything. The house Abena claimed, the land she strutted across, the very foundation of their pride. It did not belong to them. It belonged to Grace and only Grace. And though she had stayed silent for the sake of peace, life was teaching her that silence could also be a sword waiting to be unsheathed. Early one morning, before the neighborhood had fully woken up, Grace wrapped her shawl tightly around her shoulders and made her way into town. Her steps were slow, but her heart was steady. The humiliation she had suffered replayed in her mind, every cruel word from Abena echoing louder than the last. But this time, instead of breaking her, the memory pushed her forward. She knew where she had to go. The lawyer's office, the very place where her husband's last wishes had been sealed. When she walked in, the lawyer, an older man named Mr. Owusu, looked up in surprise. "Madam Mensah," he said warmly. "It's been years. What brings you here?" Grace's eyes filled with quiet determination. "I need the documents," she whispered. He nodded slowly, understanding more than she said. From a locked cabinet, he pulled out a thick envelope sealed with his firm stamp. Inside were the original deed to the house, Kwame's signed will, and even letters confirming her full ownership. As Grace spread the papers out on his desk, her hands trembled, not with fear but with the weight of truth. She sat there for a long time staring at the papers. Memories of her husband came rushing back. His wisdom, his gentle warnings, his trust in her to carry the family after he was gone. She could almost hear his voice. "Sometimes even blood can fail. But you, Grace, must never fail yourself." Tears welled in her eyes, but she wiped them quickly. The time for tears had passed. Carefully, she folded the documents back into the envelope and pressed it to her chest. She knew she could walk into Kojo's house that very moment and silence everyone with the truth. She could end Abena's pride, end the whispers, end the shame. But Grace was not a woman of rash moves. She understood the power of timing. If she struck too soon, they would call her bitter. If she struck too late, her dignity would remain buried. She needed the perfect moment, the moment when their arrogance was at its peak, so the fall would be unforgettable. As she left the lawyer's office, the morning sun broke through the clouds. Grace walked down the street with her head held higher than it had been in weeks. She was no longer the broken woman who had slept on a couch. She was a woman holding a truth strong enough to shake an entire family. And in her heart she whispered, "They will learn who I truly am, but not today." Soon. The weeks passed and Abena's confidence grew louder with every passing day. She walked around the neighborhood with her chin lifted high, telling anyone who would listen that she was planning to expand her house. She bragged about new rooms, modern tiles, and how soon people would envy her for turning the old family home into a mansion. Relatives nodded politely, though some whispered quietly among themselves, wondering why Grace had vanished from the scene without protest. Abena, however, mistook their silence for admiration, never imagining what was about to unfold. Finally, Abena decided to make her claims official. She called for a grand family meeting, inviting uncles, aunties, cousins, and neighbors. The sitting room was filled with voices and laughter, though underneath it all was a sense of unease. Grace's absence still weighed on some of them, but no one dared to question Abena directly. She stood in the center of the room like a queen addressing her court, clapping her hands for attention. "Family," she declared proudly, "I have exciting news. Kojo and I will be building an extension. This house will no longer look like an old relic. It will be a modern home, fit for the next generation. And as the lady of the house, I will make sure it shines." Her words dripped with pride, her eyes daring anyone to challenge her. Just then the door creaked open. Heads turned, and a sudden hush fell over the room. Grace stepped inside, her presence commanding attention even without a word. She wore a simple but elegant dress, her scarf neatly tied, and in her hand she carried a sealed brown envelope. She did not rush, she did not frown. She walked with the quiet dignity of a woman who knew exactly what she carried. Some relatives gasped softly. Others exchanged puzzled glances. "What is she doing here?" a cousin whispered under his breath. Abena's confident smile faltered for a split second but quickly returned, though her eyes betrayed her discomfort. Grace moved forward slowly, greeting elders with a respectful nod before taking her seat at the table. She placed the envelope in front of her and rested her hand on it gently, as though it held the weight of the world. The room grew tense. Whispers died down. Everyone's eyes shifted between Abena's proud stance and Grace's calm silence. They sensed something was coming, something that would shake the ground beneath their feet. And Grace, with the patience of a lioness, was ready. Abena could not resist one last jab. With her arms folded and her voice sharp, she looked straight at Grace and said, "You are nothing here. This house belongs to me now. You should have stayed gone instead of embarrassing yourself by showing up." Laughter bubbled from a few of Abena's allies in the room, and Grace's son, Kojo, sat frozen, his eyes glued to the floor, too weak to defend his own mother. The air grew heavy, every word Abena spoke dripping with arrogance. But Grace did not flinch. She reached forward, her fingers steady, and slid the brown envelope to the center of the table. Slowly, deliberately, she unsealed it and pulled out a neat stack of papers. The room fell silent, as though time itself had stopped, every eye fixed on her hands as she unfolded the first sheet and placed it flat on the polished wood. Her voice, calm and unwavering, broke the silence. "This house," she said, tapping the document with her finger. "This land, they are mine. My husband left everything in my name before he passed." Her eyes locked with Abena's, whose confident smile had now vanished. Grace's tone grew sharper, her words cutting like a blade. "I allowed you to live here out of love for my son. But after what you did to me, that ends today." Gasps echoed around the room. Uncles leaned forward, cousins exchanged wide-eyed glances, and the neighbors who had come to witness the meeting covered their mouths in shock. Abena's face drained of color, her hands trembling as if the very ground beneath her had collapsed. Kojo, still silent, closed his eyes, shame washing over him. Grace continued, spreading the rest of the papers for all to see. The signed will, the deed of ownership, the official letters with her name clearly written. There was no denying it, no way to twist the truth. Every word she spoke was backed by law, love, and the foresight of her late husband. Abena's mouth opened, but no words came out. The room that once echoed with her proud voice now swallowed her silence whole. Grace sat tall, her dignity restored, her presence commanding. For the first time in a long while, she was no longer the victim. She was the rightful matriarch, and everyone knew it. The moment the last paper touched the table, the room froze. No one dared to breathe too loudly. The once buzzing meeting had turned into a heavy silence that pressed against everyone's chest. Eyes darted from the documents to Grace, then to Abena, whose proud smile had vanished completely. Her lips quivered, her hands clutched the edge of her chair as if she might faint. All her arrogance, all her loud claims, crumbled like sand beneath a wave. Gasps rippled across the relatives seated around the room. Some covered their mouths, others shook their heads in disbelief. The same voices that once whispered that Grace was weak and unwanted now murmured in awe. For the first time, they saw her not as the discarded mother-in-law, but as the woman who had held the keys to everything all along. The power in the room shifted, and everyone could feel it. Kojo sat frozen beside his wife. His head sank lower and lower, shame burning on his face. He could not meet his mother's eyes, nor the judging stares of his uncles and aunties. The man who should have defended his mother was exposed as a coward, and the weight of that realization crushed him. Even his own cousins looked at him with disappointment, shaking their heads. Abena's voice, which had filled the house so confidently before, was now gone. She tried to speak, but no words came. Her throat tightened, her pride choking her from within. She looked at the papers again, her eyes wide, knowing she had lost. The house she claimed, the land she boasted about, the authority she wore like a crown. It all slipped away in one moment with one envelope. And then everyone looked at Grace. She did not need to raise her voice. She did not even need to gloat. She simply sat upright, her calm presence louder than any words. Her silence spoke volumes. Said, "I was never powerless. I was never beneath you. I only chose peace until you forced me to show my strength." The atmosphere was electric. The same family that once pitted her now respected her, their eyes shining with a mixture of admiration and regret. Grace had transformed from victim to victor in a single breath, and in that silence her dignity filled every corner of the room. The silence that had swallowed the room finally broke with Abena's desperate voice. She slid from her chair and dropped to her knees, her eyes wide and frantic. The proud woman who once commanded the household now clung to Grace's skirt like a frightened child. "Mama, please. I didn't mean it. I was only angry. Give me one more chance, she cried, her words dripping with fear instead of arrogance. The same relatives who once cheered her on now turned their faces away, ashamed to even look at her. Kojo, unable to bear the weight of his shame, also rose from his seat and bowed his head. His lips trembled as he stammered, "Mother, forgive us. We were blind. We let pride destroy us. Please don't throw us out." But his words fell flat, hollow echoes of the son who once ignored his mother's tears. He had betrayed her in her lowest moment, and now he stood exposed in front of everyone. Grace's eyes glistened, but not with weakness. She stood tall, her voice calm yet sharp like a blade. "Respect is not asked for, it is earned. And you have lost it." The firmness in her tone silenced even the whispers in the room. Every word carried the weight of years of sacrifice, years of silence, and years of betrayal. She had begged for dignity once before. Now she no longer needed to beg. Slowly, she turned to her lawyer, who had been quietly observing from the corner of the room. Without hesitation, she said, "Begin the eviction procedures." Gasps filled the air. The relatives exchanged stunned looks. No one had expected Grace to go this far. But the truth was clear, she was done being trampled on. Abena clutched her chest as if her heart might stop. Kojo's knees buckled, and for the first time, the couple who once strutted around as masters of the house trembled like powerless children. Their empire of pride had collapsed in a single moment, leaving them exposed before the same family they had tried to impress. Grace did not gloat. She did not shout. Her calm authority was louder than any humiliation they had ever thrown at her. And as she stood there, dignified and unshaken, everyone in the room realized that the true matriarch had just reclaimed her throne. The sun set softly over Kumasi as Grace walked back into the house that had once echoed with humiliation and pain. But this time the atmosphere was different. Relatives stood at the gate, clapping as she entered. Neighbors gathered around, not with pity but with admiration. Children ran to her, their laughter filling the compound, a sound of new beginnings. Grace held her head high, her steps slow but firm, every movement declaring that she was no longer the broken woman they had once whispered about. She was the crowned matriarch. Inside the living room, women from the community embraced her, their eyes wet with pride. "You showed us that dignity has no age," one said. Men who had doubted her nodded respectfully, offering their support. Grace did not gloat. She simply smiled, her calm presence silencing the room more powerfully than anger ever could. The house, once stolen from her with cruelty, now welcomed her back as its rightful queen. Days later, Grace stood on the very land her husband had worked so hard for. She had called the elders, the pastor, and community leaders. With papers in hand, she announced her decision. The land would no longer be a symbol of conflict but a gift to those who had nothing. "Here," she declared, "we will build a center for widows and orphans, so no one will ever feel cast aside like I once did." The crowd erupted in applause, women ululating with joy, men clapping, children cheering. The walls of the new community center began to rise, brick by brick, as if carrying Grace's story within them. Her pain had been turned into purpose. Those who had once mocked her now worked alongside her, laying foundations for a future filled with hope. Even Kojo, her son, returned quietly, watching from a distance, humbled and ashamed, but aware that his mother's strength had created something greater than his silence ever could. One evening, as the center's signboard was unveiled, Grace stood before the crowd. The wind carried her words like a blessing. "They tried to throw me out, but I held the keys all along." The people roared in applause, and in that moment, Grace wasn't just a mother or a widow. She was a living legacy, a matriarch crowned not by family, but by the entire community.